Now that we've talked about how to identify our risks and our threats and how we can come up with that risk impact to know how those risks are going to impact the organization, now we're going to talk about some ways that we mitigate risks, some ways to manage those risks. And there's a couple different techniques or different types of ways of dealing with risk. One way you could deal with risk is called transference, which is where we make a third party responsible for that risk. So that's something that almost all of us do. If you own a home or a car, chances are you have homeowners insurance to cover your house, or if you rent an apartment, you have renter's insurance. Or if you drive a car, you have auto insurance, which I've talked about already in the previous slide deck. So transference, the classic example of transference is buying insurance. So insurance is risk transference. You're saying you take the risk. Most of us have health insurance, or hopefully most of us have health insurance. If you get hurt and go to the ER and you're badly injured, that could be, $30,000 going to the ER. Hopefully it only happens once or twice in your life, but how many of us have $30,000 to pay the ER that one time it happens? Very few of us do. So to transfer that risk, we pay for insurance, and we amortize that cost over a long period of time throughout our lives. So that is a classic example of transference, and of course we do that with corporate IT. We transfer risk in lots of different ways, but of course the most common is going to be insurance. Another way is risk avoidance, which is identifying the risk and making the decision not to engage in that activity. So avoiding that risk. So for example, I work in healthcare. I work in medical imaging mostly. And one of the risks is that you're going to get sued if the doctor misdiagnoses a patient. So one way they try to avoid that risk in some cases is by not saving the data that a patient could use to prove that they didn't read their x-rays correctly. So a lot of computers help the doctors read x-rays. They use things called CAD, computer-aided diagnostics, where computers will analyze the images and put markings on it and tell the doctor where to look or something like that. And if the computer said you should have seen it and they didn't see it, of course, that's going to be, an open and shut case. So one way to avoid that risk is simply to not save that information, to throw it away when you're done, or simply don't save patient data for longer than you have to. So that would be another example of risk avoidance. I know these are pretty callous examples, but, people do these things to try to avoid risk. Another way is mitigation. So that's addressing the risk by making it less serious or taking steps that help prevent that risk. So that would be mitigation. In reality, most organizations engage in all three of these. I talked about the example of a fire, classic example being our data center burning down. It could happen. I've known people who's had it happen to them. But a lot of times to protect our data center, we might use all three of these. We will transfer part of the risk by having fire insurance. We'll try to avoid that risk and mitigate that risk by having fire alarms, by locating it in a place that's least likely to have a fire. We're also going to have fire suppression systems. And all of these things combined are how we're going to manage that risk. So in most cases, we're going to have all three of these risk responses dealing with a single asset. So some risk models. There are three basic risk models. There's preventative risk models, which is the most effective since it minimizes the possibility of a loss from even occurring. So preventative mitigation is things like using an antivirus, having firewalls to prevent traffic from getting into our network that could be harmful, training and things like that. Detective is where we simply try to identify that the loss has occurred, and then we try to deal with it. That's, of course, the least effective because we've already lost, we've already lost our data. So, for example, a preventative for our data center fire might be a fire suppression system, and it's very effective because it puts out the fire before it causes damage. Whereas the least effective is if we just had fire alarms in our data center. That's great. The alarms are going to go off and tell us there's a fire, but there's not much we can do about it. By the time the fire department gets there, we've likely lost everything. So that would be a detective measure. And then corrective is minimizing impact by restoring the system to its state at a point before the event. So, for example, with our data center fire, one corrective measure that we could take for that risk is perhaps having some sort of spare data center. So we haven't really talked about this much yet, but you have hot sites and cold sites. So you might have a hot site data center or a warm site, which is a hybrid, which we'll talk about in another time. But that might be a way of or a corrective measure. So in other words, when the loss happens, you have a way to recover from that loss. So some different types of controls. There are three basic types of controls. The first is management risk control types. These are things like laws, regulations, policies, guidelines, governance, all of the things that sort of tell us what we need to do to reduce risks. The second is a technical risk control. And of course, that's what most of us deal with in IT security. So in a program like this, I would say most of you, if you're going to go out and get a job in IT security, in the beginning, you mostly be working with technical risk control types, which would be things like firewalls, using encryption to protect your data, having antiviruses to protect your workstations and your servers and things like that from malware, proxy servers and DMZs and all those other technologies that we talk about. Later on in the course, we're going to spend 4 units talking about technical risk controls. So we spend a lot of time in this course looking at that. We do spend a little bit of time in this course as well talking about some management risk control types, which would be policies and procedures and things like that. The last one is operational risk control types, and these are procedures that limit risk. So management risk controls and operational kind of seem like a gray area, like they're the same, but they're really not. Management risk control types are the regulations, the laws, the policies, and the guidelines, but operational risk control types are things that tell you the steps that you specifically take to reduce that risk. So it's more like a standard operating procedure or an SOP that tells you exactly how to handle your data. It tells you how to handle creating user accounts. It tells you how to create your password and things like that. Those would be operational risk control types. So for example, a management risk control could be that passwords should be secure. That would be a very vague managerial risk control type. But when the boot hits the dirt, really it's operational. The operational risk control would be passwords must be at least 8 characters, contain uppercase letters, lowercase, and special characters or something like that, numbers and letters or whatever. A technical risk control type in that example would be Active Directory group policy that enforces that password control. So make sure that people put in those strong passwords. And we'll talk about some of those technologies later on. So again, these are the 3 control types that we have to help us manage risks. So from a managerial perspective, some things that you can do to mitigate risk if you're working in IT security. Privilege management is one, change management is another, and incident management. These I cover a little bit in some of the other units, but I wanted to touch on that a little bit here in this unit because they play very closely with controlling risk. So as far as privilege management, it's the process of assigning and revoking privileges to objects and covers procedures for managing object authorizations. We're going to talk about this in much more detail when we talk about authorization and authentication. We talk about it very briefly in this course, though. We cover authentication and authorization in much more detail in IT Security 2. We talk about specific mechanisms to do that. But from a management perspective with risk, we want to make sure we're auditing the privileges of our user accounts. We're making sure that we have some kind of privilege management in place to make sure that, number one, the folks that have authorization that can authenticate and are authorized to use IT assets have the correct authority, and that those passwords or those credentials can't be usurped by an attacker somehow. And we'll talk about, in IT Security 2, we talk about specific ways attackers do that, but we want to make sure we have some way to prevent that from happening. Change management is very important. One of the big things that happens in IT, and this is definitely a big IT security thing, is changes happen that are not planned for properly or we're not expecting, and it causes adverse effects, which is a huge risk. So change management is a methodology for making modifications and keeping track of changes over time. And it's also important to keep track of those changes because when you establish a baseline on certain devices with the technical controls, when you establish a technical control baseline, it's important that you maintain that baseline. So, somebody might say one day, oh, you know what? Somebody needs port number 5000 opened in the firewall for some specific application temporarily. So you open up that port and then they're done and you forget to close it. So it's important to have some kind of procedure and some kind of process in place that can identify that that's not supposed to be open. It needs to be closed. That's one more avenue of attack. It's one more vulnerability in our network, for example, which again, we talk more about that stuff in IT security too. So change management, of course, is super important. So the change management team is usually some group that oversees the changes, and we'll talk more about CMT in our unit on policies and procedures later on in IT security governance. So proposed changes must first be approved by the change management team or a change management board. I think your textbook calls it a change management board, but the concept is the same. It's a group of people, and usually it's a cross-sectional group of people from lots of different areas in the organization that are reviewing those changes to evaluate what the effect of those changes are going to be across the whole organization. And in many organizations, the change management board has to review all proposed changes, not just certain ones. So every change that's being made to some production process or system or any asset is evaluated for its impact and either recommended for approval, disproved, or deferred, usually because they need more information or they're not sure how it's going to affect, so they're waiting to do some sort of assessment. Incident management is the last thing. So incident management, why this is important for risk management, is when an incident happens, we can evaluate that incident and we can figure out how in the future to better prepare for and mitigate that same incident. So it gives us some sort of a framework in order to figure out how we can handle that incident much more efficiently or much better than we did in the past. So basically, incident management is how we learn from previous risks and previous threats, and then we can apply that to our existing threat assessment and our risk assessment to try to mitigate those or further mitigate those risks and prevent those risks in the future. So that concludes this unit on risk management. Thank you for watching.